Here we're going to talk and hear more from David Laird about this incredible moment in the history of this city, both the plague and the fire of London in 1665 and 66 respectively, which we were just discussing before, is sort of seared into the public consciousness, those dates, and the impact on the city. This house came about in terms of its construction the same time as the whole of Gough Square. As a result of the Great Fire of London, that property redevelopment that took place, I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about. So this building has a sort of a link to that period in many ways, and part of its legacy of what happened in the aftermath of this catastrophic event. David Laird is the one who's going to tell us all about it. He himself is steeped in London and Edinburgh history, amongst other things. Works over in the Tower Bridge as its education officer, so he's really very steeped in knowledge about this square mile in which we're situated, but also more broadly. And he's recently set up the Heritage Guides. Absolutely, there's some cards on the table, pick some up later, and you can join David and his team on walks around the city and other places as well, looking at the history of the streets of London. Without further ado, if you could just join me in welcoming David. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for such a lovely welcome this afternoon. Can you hear me at the back? That's the main thing before we start. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you for the introduction. My name is David. I'm the founder of Heritage Guides. We are a new walking tour company based in London. And I've lived in the city for roughly 16 years, working in guiding and community engagement and some of the incredible built heritage. But over the years, nothing has intrigued me more than reading the history of arguably the city's darkest decade, the 1660s. And I am very aware of our content for today, and I did forget that there were sandwiches, so I do apologise to anyone who's still eating when we get on to descriptions of the plague. Now, the 1660s, this was a period where the celebration of a returning king and the end to the shackles of civil war and republic became quickly replaced by the horrors of war, plague and fire. And so today I'm going to be talking about a rather incredible 18 months between 1665 to 1667 and the structural legacy of those years by telling you the story of the monument to the Great Fire of London. But to begin, in the 17th century, fantastic, there we go. By the beginning of the 17th century, London had more than 250,000 people living in it. And by the end, almost 500,000, with some estimates reporting that 600,000 people lived within the square mile we find ourselves in the middle of today. Most of these would have been poor and undocumented migrants who had flocked to the capital in search of work, making London the centre of government, trade and finance. And in terms of an economy, London ruled not only the English mercantile sector, but it dominated the rural economy of the southeast, with its demanding and ever-increasing need for food and clothing. And it wouldn't be until the middle of the 17th century that the rural economy would fully recover and it would see a period of sustained growth. So it's a surprising note that from 1600 up until the end of the century, when the nation could barely feed itself, by 1700 it was an exporter of grain. Now, the economic divides that existed between rich and poor, between surplus and subsistence producers, was a principal determinant of rank and status. English society at this time was organised hierarchically, with a tightly defined ascending order of privileges and responsibilities. In towns, tradesmen and shopkeepers occupied the ranks below the ruling elites. They would have been known as the middling sort, and were both active in civic and church affairs, holding the same minor offices as yeomen and husbandmen. And because of the greater concentrations of wealth and educational opportunities, the urban middling sort were often active in local politics. At the top of 17th century political life was, of course, the monarch. From Elizabeth I to James VI and I, it would be Charles I who dominated and had the biggest impact on the mid-century's politics. Starting badly from 1625, he inherited a domestic economic crisis and a war with Spain. And this was followed by a series of bad grain harvests, a decline in the domestic cloth trade, and the first of several virulent plagues that would kill tens of thousands and challenge the new king's reign. And of course it would begin to compound almost instantly in a crisis, that of the Parliament of 1625. Now, though this Parliament was called by Charles, it was still there to determine whether reform was needed to the customs process and to try and put limits on the Crown's levy of impositions. But despite all of these reforms, the king continued to collect levies to prevent his own bankruptcy. Internal friction would spill over into civil war by 1642, as Charles went to war with his own parliament in their opposition to his absolute rule. And for the remainder of the decades, as factions, allegiances, incompetency within the civil conflict ebbed and flowed across all of Charles's three kingdoms, he would ultimately lose at the hands of parliamentary lead Oliver Cromwell, not only his status as ruler and his kingdoms, but on the 30th of January 1649, his head. Now, the execution of the king aroused hostility not only in England, but also throughout Europe. Regicide was considered one of, if not the worst crime. But by 1660, his son Charles II would complete the retaking of the throne. Now, for the 1650s, England and London would be ruled by the government of the Commonwealth. And in its early stages, this new ruling party abolished both the monarchy and the House of Lords. But by 1660 and his 30th birthday, Charles II once again arrived in London. Though his years in European exile had developed a thick skin and a sense of political realism. This was displayed in the Declaration of Breda, 1660, in which Charles offered something to everyone in terms of his resuming of government. A general pardon would be issued, tolerant religious settlements made, and a security for private property assured. However, Charles II could not undo all of the effects of the Civil War and its revolution. But that is not to say, of course, that all were negative. By his restoration, England had now become a potent military power as wars against France and Spain expanded the country's colonial dominions. Colonial trade became an important source of royal revenue, and Charles II continued Cromwell's policy of restricting trade to English ships by imposing duties on imports and exports. Charles's Navigation Acts of 1660 and 63 were directed against the Dutch. Still the most powerful commercial force in Europe, these Navigation Acts would result in war with the Dutch, 1665 to 67 and 72 to 74. Effectively a standoff, but in economic terms, a decisive English victory. And of course, the American colonies were consolidated by the capture of New York, and the policy of the Navigation Acts was effectively established. Colonial trade and English shipping began to mushroom. And in the long run, Charles's aggressive foreign policy would solve the Crown's perpetual fiscal crises. But for all of these long-term successes on an international level, domestic policy would provide an unwelcome distraction of cataclysmic event. And so we move to the 1st of January 1665. Now this year would begin largely without incident, as the famed 3-month festive celebrations of the Stuart royal house rolled on into the new year. By March, London would once again become noted as a centre for academic and scientific excellence, as the famed Royal Society published its first scientific journal titled Philosophical Transactions. Art and culture would return, as Charles II's famed mistress and actress, there she is, Nell Gwynn, made her London stage debut. But from the distance of the Low Countries and the lips of sea mariners on the Channel and North Sea, rumours of an illness began to spread into the city. And it was thus recorded on the 12th of April 1665 that the first victims of the Great Plague of London were confirmed dead. Over the next few months, it would spread as far north as Derby and kill close to 100,000 of London's population. Now, the Great Plague of London was the last major epidemic of the bubonic plague in England. And on a much smaller scale than the Black Death of 1349, it formed part of a larger series of more contained epidemics that took place up until the mid-18th century. Now, the bubonic plague is a potentially deadly infection of bacteria known as Yersinia pestis, passed on through the bites of infected fleas found largely on rats. And though we talk about it today as being something from the history books, from 2010 until 2015, there were still 3,248 cases worldwide, resulting in 584 deaths. Now, it's been called the Black Death, or in Scotland, and I do quote directly from 14th century soldiers, the foul stench of the English. And that was in reference to its gangrenous blackening of body parts such as fingers and toes. Once infected, a person usually became ill with plague between 2 to 6 days after exposure. And it would manifest as tender, enlarged lymph nodes, sometimes as large as a chicken egg appearing on the groin and armpit. Everyone has finished their lunch. Other symptoms could include a fever, chills, headache and muscle aches, tiredness and respiratory difficulties. Bacteria could also enter the bloodstream and cause sepsis, which would lead to tissue damage, organ failure and ultimately death, as blood and pus seeped out of the swellings. But where did it come from? Well, plague was one of the hazards of life in London from its dramatic first appearance in 1348. And the city began to publish its mortality records consisting from 1603. In this year, there were 33,347 deaths recorded from the plague. Now, between then and 1665, only 4 years passed without there being a recorded case. But the Great Plague is believed to have spread from the Netherlands, where the disease had been occurring intermittently since 1599. And with the initial contagion arriving on Dutch trading ships carrying cotton from Amsterdam, the first areas to be struck were the docks just outside of London and the parish of St Giles, which today straddles modern-day Holborn and Bloomsbury, just round the corner. Now, in both of these localities, poor workers were crowded into ill-kept structures. And whilst 2 suspicious deaths were recorded in St Giles Parish in 1664 and another in 1665, these did not appear as plague deaths on the bills of mortality, so no control measures could be taken. Though undeniably, the total number of people dying through the first 4 months of 1665 were now beginning to show a marked increase. By the end of April, total deaths per week had risen from 290 to 398, and as plague began to spread, it became a huge concern for the people of London, with the most effective defence being that of absence. King Charles II left the city and stayed in Oxford. Parliament relocated likewise from London to Oxford. And the wealthy, who could afford to move out of the city, began to flee in an exodus. Crucially, this included the city's doctors, reducing the number of skilled people available to treat plague victims within the square mile. People trying to flee the plague also contributed to its spread. For example, to the north, as those escaping through Islington and Highgate, where the disease was rampant. The Mayor of London, Sir John Lawrence, stayed in the city and tried to come up with ways to stop the spread. He made sure that searchers were appointed to identify plague victims, as well as ensuring food supplies were maintained so that people would not go hungry. The spread of the disease was captured by an MP, a naval staffer, and famed diarist Samuel Pepys. Living in London and refusing to leave during the outbreak, Pepys would keep a detailed diary in which he recorded his thoughts and observations. For example, close to the midsummer, on the 7th of June 1665, Pepys writes, Today I saw 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord have mercy on us written in them, which was a sad sight to me, as it was the first time I'd seen this, and it made me nervous. Now by the 4th of September in that year, he began writing letters all the morning, and he quotes, among those letters written was one to one Lady Carteret, telling her the state of the city and the other sad stories. It troubled me to walk past Combe Farm, where about 21 people had died of the plague, and it's 3 or 4 days since I saw a body in a coffin lying unburied. And the watchers look at the houses all night to make sure that the people stay in. The plague is making us as cruel as dogs to one another. But how did they stop? How did they cure the plague? Well, on a practical level, there was only really one way that the plague could be stopped. For we know that at that time, government and individuals, they had attempted to cure its spread through the following measures. And as you listen, just ponder how many of these seem familiar to our own recent history. Fires were lit in the street so people could breathe and smell in the smoke, rather than the miasma believed to be causing the disease. There was a culling of cats and dogs, as it is believed that they might have been the source and spreader of the plague. And it's estimated that between 40,000 dogs and 200,000 cats were killed during the outbreak. Plague victims were locked in their houses for 40 days, and a red cross was painted on their door. And searchers had the job of entering the home of a suspected plague victim to search for bodies and removing them to be placed in burial pits. Public gatherings were banned, and people were not allowed to travel from one town to another unless they had a certificate proving that they didn't have the plague. And as these measures were being enforced, slowly over the remaining months, and by late autumn, the death toll in London and its suburbs had begun to subside. By February of 1666, it was considered safe enough for the king to return. And with Charles back in London, so too did the gentry, the judges and Parliament. Trade recommenced and businesses were once again able to open. And though plague cases would sporadically continue until mid-1666, for the time being at least, normal life in the city could resume. But on the 1st of January 1666, a year that would become known as the Annus Mirabilis, a wonderful year, strangely enough. This was because it had seen victory achieved over the Dutch, at least initially. And in the early months of 1666, life, society and government began to return to normal. Of one of the many changes that would be seen was the appointment of a new Lord Mayor in London, Lord Mayor Thomas Bloodworth. Now Bloodworth was a merchant and a politician who would go on to sit in Parliament until the late 1670s. However, his biggest impact in remembrance to history would take place on an infamous evening that September. It was on the 2nd of September 1666, at roughly 1 o'clock in the morning, that a spark would make its way from the oven of a Pudding Lane bakery occupied by one Thomas Farrimer onto straw-covered flooring below. This would start one of the most destructive events in the City of London's history. Now, considering the devastating impact of the bubonic plague a year prior, London, in the dry summer heat of 1666, still had a population of roughly 130,000 people, crammed into 1 square mile, which still makes up largely still makes up the boundary to the City of London today. Now, contemporary houses were made of plaster, mud and straw, and through the city's narrow streets, the Great Fire spread quickly. First down Fish Street Hill towards the Thames, aided by the close proximity of structures, materials, and a strong wind blowing from the east. Without any fire service, but with the incompetent and dismissive attitude of the named Lord Mayor, the true villain of the next few days, Thomas Bloodworth, the destruction caused by the fire was nothing short of a total devastation. Burning until the 5th of September, the fire would destroy 85% of the city, consuming in total over 13,200 homes, 85 churches, including, of course, the medieval centrepiece of St Paul's. And this image really gives you an idea. You can see the outline from the white of just how much damage and the spread from all over in today's Blackfriars all the way to the tower in the east. Now, whilst there were only 6 reported deaths confirmed from the fire, it left at least 100,000 Londoners homeless. This would put contemporary 17th century estimates of property loss then at £5 to £7 million. And in the immediate aftermath, there were 3 key events that would take place. The first was a growing refugee crisis would see the scattered population of London encamped in areas including Moorfields, Parliament Hill, Southwark, Islington, and as far north again onto Highgate Hill. Secondly, and though later proved to be innocent, a Frenchman by the name of Robert Hubert would confess to the crime of starting the Great Fire. This would see him hanged at Tyburn Prison on the 27th of October. But incredibly, an event that would take place, and it would happen almost while the fires were still smouldering, is that there would be 7 different plans for the rebuilding of the city. These prospective town planners were the famed Sir Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, John Evelyn, Valentine Knight, and Richard Newcourt, whose plan would later be used as a template when building Philadelphia in the US. Now, of each differing design, we know that by the 11th of September, a mere 6 days after the fire ended, Sir Christopher Wren would submit his plans as displayed here to the King. And you can see straight lines and the wide avenues that he intended for the new city. Now, though neither Wren or any of the subsequent 6 plans would be used post-fire, as, and to quote, neither the Crown or the city had the funds necessary to push through for reaching urban renewal projects, the city therefore retook its old form. Now, the immediate administrative action after the fire began with a parliamentary inquiry headed by Sir Robert Brooks. Brooks concluded that the fire was caused by the hand of God, a great wind, and a very dry season. And Parliament would go on to pass initially 2 laws, the 1666 and 67 Rebuilding of London Act and the Fire Disputes Act. These would control building costs, their materials, dictate design regulation and land ownership. But rebuilding would commence only 8 months after the fire, with 15,000 buildings completed over the next 2 decades. And of course, one of the first and arguably most important to be built was the ye olde Cheshire Cheese there on Fleet Street. And again, handily, very, very close to us today. But central to all of this rebuild would be a structure intended to act as an eternal visual reminder of the Great Fire and a subsequent embodiment to celebrate London rising back from the ashes. And so too, the construction of the monument began in the November of 1671. Now, the plague of the previous year would be remembered with the death of over 15% of London's population. Their memorial would be in the tens, if not hundreds, of plague pits that were scattered across scattered across the city and the immediate countryside. Most of these sites were originally in the grounds of churches, but as the body count grew and graveyards became full, dedicated pits were hastily constructed around the fields surrounding the city. Of the more famous was St Botolph's Church close to Aldgate Station. Author Daniel Defoe, in his book A Journal of the Plague Year, he describes the pit, and I do quote, "A terrible pit it was, and I could not resist my curiosity to go and see it. As near as I may judge, it was about 40 feet in length and about 15 or 16 feet broad, and at the time I first looked at it, about 9 feet deep. But it was said that they had dug it 20 feet deep. After in one part of it, they could still go no deeper for the water. They had come to dig several pits here before." Now, though the plague was a long coming to our parish, when it did come, there was no parish, or about London where it raged, with such violence as in the 2 parishes of Aldgate and Whitechapel. Now, in contrast to the disaster of 1666, what was being commemorated through the monument was confirmed by King Charles II. The monument itself was designed in a Doric column style, and the structure was loosely based on the column of Trajan in Rome. Now, we know that there were at least 3 other variations considered in the initial design of the monument. One was a phoenix rising from the flames, with a gold flame emanating up the shaft. Another was with King Charles II himself, placed at the top, standing 15 feet high. And there was actually a story that it was Wren managed to convince the king that he didn't want to be at the top of the monument because, of course, it was there to symbolise the Great Fire, and did he want to be the eternal reminder of who was on the throne at the time. There was also an orb design, and ultimately that which we have today. And the monument has stood just to the north side of London Bridge since Tuesday the 21st of September 1677. Now, though the structure itself is often fully credited to Sir Christopher Wren, we now believe that he oversaw the build in his official capacity as the King's Royal Surveyor, sort of executive producer, if you like. But rather, it would be Robert Hooke who would oversee the design and construction of the monument as its principal architect. Now, the Hooke-Wren team had become a highly visible partnership in the City of London. Hooke and Wren's relationship is believed to have been that of a close working relationship, but also to a degree something of a personal friendship. They both worked closely on building the monument, but also the Greenwich Royal Observatory and a number of the City of London's churches. But sadly, due to fire in the Guildhall in the 19th century, no structural plan of the original column exists today. And sadly, due to the desecration by Sir Isaac Newton, no image exists today of Sir Robert Hooke. The best credible possible example that we have is this one. So we believe, these are some of Hooke's different experiments, and we believe that this possibly could be Robert Hooke here. This image has been dug out of a library up in Cambridge University. Now, the monument was built on the site of Old St Margaret's Church on Fish Street Hill, and one of the first buildings to be destroyed by the fire. Now, the location of the site would prove one of much debate and purpose. The diarist, John Evelyn, initially believed that the column should have been built on the exact location that the Great Fire began. But there's 2 reasons as to why this didn't take place. One, the ground was found not to be suitable. And secondly, and possibly more intriguingly, by 1669, Thomas Fariner, the owner of the bakery where the Great Fire of London started, had already paid his fee to have a foundation survey done with the intention of rebuilding his business. Therefore, it would be that Fariner managed to acquire his land back prior to the construction, which puts to bed the myth that the monument, should it have been pushed over from where it stands today, would land on the exact spot where the fire took place. A nice story, but a little convenient for the purposes. But importantly, the column would occupy the main northern approach into London from London Bridge, so that anyone entering or leaving the city would be reminded of the monument's message, with its glistening orb and its detailed imagery. Standing at 202 feet tall, the monument is constructed of limestone, sourced from Portland in Dorset. And at 62 metres tall, with 311 steps to the top, the platform provides a 360-degree view of London and beyond. Now, to complete the build, the total cost was £13,500. And of this, £11,300 was paid to Joshua Marshall, the master mason, to complete the base and the structure of the column shaft. But from the beginning, completion of the build would be blighted by frustrations and problems. Prior to breaking foundation, there had been difficulty in sourcing enough Portland stone, and this would lead to a royal proclamation forbidding any person to transport the stone from the Isle of Portland without the express and written permission of Sir Christopher Wren. The second issue that arose from the construction was that the building site existed in a near state of total calamity. The city initially showed no insistence on the works being closed to the public. So intent were the curious on experiencing the unique panoramas from the top of the monument that residents living in the immediate vicinity complained of the danger of the falling of scaffolds by the continual concourse of people that came to see and climb the column. Thus, the Court of Aldermen decreed on the 8th of August 76 that only workmen were to be granted access to the site. But a third issue that came to light with the completion of the frieze emanating on the western face of the monument's base. Now, the frieze was completed by Caius Gabriel Cibber at a cost of about £600. Cibber, the son of a Danish cabinet maker, was known for a number of his famous works. Close to this parish, he was employed by Wren to carve the pediments on the eastern front of Hampton Court Palace. Further, he executed the architectural flourishes on St Paul's Cathedral, and the aptly titled Raving Madness and Melancholy Madness, which fronted at the 17th century London Bedlam. Now, Cibber was paid 7 times for his work on the monument, which included both the western frieze and the griffins on the top. But Cibber himself brought with him a number of issues. For all of his genius as a sculptor, Cibber was not the best with his finances and had found himself in the debtor's prison just across the river in the Clink. Therefore, to complete the work on the monument, both Wren and Hooke had to pay for day release for Cibber on numerous days. So, although he completed this incredible work on the base of the monument, he would finish it without a penny in his pocket. Now, one quirk of the monument's design is its posting of 4 dragons on the 4 corners of the base. These were carved by one Edward Pearce at a cost of £10 each. Now, what the little quirk of these dragons being is that the dragons facing the east raise their heads, whilst the dragons facing east raise their heads, whilst the dragons facing west lower theirs. This was a deliberate intention to symbolise the rebuilding of London and indeed the monument as being a collaborative effort between the city and the crown. Of course, lowering their heads out of respect to the king in the west, whilst raising them out of the civil presence in the east. Now, construction of the monument can be summarised through 5 key dates drawn from the diary of Robert Hooke. By the 19th of October 73, he describes having a perfect pillar in place. By the 1st of June the following year, he describes the pillar on Fish Street Hill as being 210 steps tall. By the 21st of September the following year, 75, he was on top of the column, and by 1677, he describes there being a low-key opening of the monument. He describes in his diary that the pillar was opened by himself and Sir Christopher Wren. So with the build now complete, it's worth discussing in a little bit more detail some of the symbolism that was intended and which can be seen attributed to the monument. For example, the very design of the structure was described as a vehicle or rocket of fire, with the tall shaft propelling a burning golden orb of flames into the sky. Say golden orb, it is actually painted copper. But the intended symbols on the monument are present on all 4 sides of its base. We start on the east, which has a list of the Lord Mayors in charge, of course a position you can only hold for a year during the construction. They began in 1671 with Sir Richard Ford and carried on through the mayor terms of George Waterman, Robert Hanson, William Hooker, Robert Viner, Joseph Sheldon, with completion during the term of Sir Thomas Davies. Now, to the north and south we find a Latin inscription written by Dr. Thomas Gale. Now, born in London, Gale was the master of St Paul's School and later would go on to become the Dean of York. Now, his text provides an account of the city's destruction by fire on its north face and a description of the restoration in order and building under the steadying hand of King Charles II. Now, the text would become one of controversy over the next 2 centuries due to its alterations. And to set the scene, the monument was built at a time when the atmosphere post-fire was that of being a place volatile towards the Catholic community. Anti-Catholic hysteria was widespread during the building of the monument. Indeed, a royal proclamation was made on the 20th of December 1666 stating that priests and Jesuits should leave England or face jail. By its completion in 1677, the Great Fire of London was generally perceived to have been that of a Catholic plot. 3 years after the completion of the monument, post at the Papist plot of Titus Oates in 1678, the Court of Common Council ordered that an inscription in Latin and English needed to be fixed to the monument, signifying that the City of London was burnt and consumed with fire by the treachery and malice of the Papists in September of 1666. But what would follow was a period of cat and mouse, as with the accession of the openly Catholic James VII and II, the text was removed. But within a few years, and the arrival of William of Orange in the so-styled Glorious Revolution of 1688 and James's tacit abdication, the text was put back on, and it wouldn't be fully removed until the 6th of December 1830. But with fewer changes, we come back to Cibber's western frieze. And this design is that of an allegorical representation of the impact of the Great Fire of London, and of course the role of King Charles II in steadying and rebuilding the city. Of course, we have King Charles II, very easy, and you can point to see him there, standing gloriously in his imperial garb, dressed as a Roman emperor. We also have the Duke of York, just behind him. Of course, the Duke was instrumental in a lot of the response in putting the fire and combating it in those early days. But there's a few others that we can point out here. We have this lady, rather dishevelled, sitting rather exposed and sitting on rubble with her sword cast aside. She bears quite a striking resemblance to that of Nell Gwyn, but she represents the city. Behind, we have the winged character of Time, and behind, again, we have the people of London, their hands up in celebration as the fire burns behind. They are to represent that over time, the city, through the people, will once again be lifted up, rebuilt, under the steadying hand of King Charles II. Now, the monument opened to visitors in mid-1677, and one of the little known facts is that it is the first attraction in London to admit paying visitors. Since that date and up until now, it has followed roughly the same opening hours, from 8 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock, or at least until the sun sets. Now, admission costs in the early 19th century were sitting at 6p per person, and Nicholas Olney was appointed as the structure's first custodian for a period of 21 years. His job was described as a profitable privilege, as he was only responsible for providing each city with a payment of £50 annually. Everything else was pure profit at his discretion. Now, far from just being a visitor attraction, the monument's initial use was as a scientific instrument. With Hooke and Wren, both members of the increasingly established Royal Society post the Great Fire of London, the column's construction was viewed as an opportunity to create an instrument for experimentation. The principal use was as that of a zenith telescope to observe stellar parallax, and this experiment involved the need for a selected fixed star to be observed in the night sky 6 months apart. Any changes to the equipment used in observation made detection of any slight changes impossible. So at this stage, should also mention that the orb at the top of the monument, and it does to this day, it still opens up into the night sky. But unfortunately, due to the vibrations from passing traffic across London Bridge, the monument would never provide a solid foundation for accuracy. It would therefore be used for more modest types of experiments. The build included a small laboratory, not accessible today on the visitor route, though a space that experiments could be carried out. We know on the 16th of May 1678 that Hooke conducted a barometer experiment, with his findings recorded in the Royal Society, that Hooke had accurately measured the pressure at various stages as he came down the monument's internal structure. Other experiments, we know that there were physics experiments conducted using pendulums, though these were mainly there to utilise the structure's height. Now, we've discussed how the monument's height was calculated to have a symbolic significance, the distance from top to bottom being the distance to the baker's house. And however contrary this may be to the intentions of Hooke and Wren, I do believe that the final height does conveniently measure the crossbeams of Old St Paul's, which was where these pendulum experiments had previously been taking place. So it's a rather bit of a coincidence that the heights would be exactly the same for the experiments being conducted again. But at this stage, just to tell you a little bit more about the history of the monument as a whole, far from just being a retreat for Royal Society members, the structure would provide many purposes and enjoy a colourful use in both an official and unofficial capacity. One of its earliest uses was that of an aviary for a bald-headed eagle. So I thought it'd be nice to begin to wrap up our talk by just telling you some of my favourite uses of the structure. Of course, one of the most important and still used to this day is that it is a place of fitness. There are still people who work for the City of London who regularly run up and down as part of their weekly routine. 311 steps to the top, so bear that in mind for the next story. Now, having never been awake early enough to join them, I started to look into what was the record for getting to the top and back down again. And the following is taken from the Weekly Journal, dated the 26th of September 1730. And it goes, "Last Thursday, a nimble little man at the Baptist Head Tavern in the Old Bailey ran up to the top of the monument and down again, for a considerable wager laid on by some gentlemen frequenting the house. He had 3 minutes to do it in, but performed it in 2.5 minutes. An extraordinary performance which only 1 in 100 can do." So having watched thousands of people climb those stairs, I would say 1 in 100 is a bit ambitious. A climb of a different sort is believed to have happened in the year of 1814. The monument stands within eyeshot of the old fish market of Billingsgate, and it was from here we understand that a publicity stunt was organised, whereby a pony belonging to a local fishmonger was led to the gallery, up to the top and down again, it is said without a slip or a stumble. Now, unfortunately, death is something that's been forever linked to the monument, with the gloomy tale being told by many tour guides that more people have taken their life from the monument than actually perished in the Great Fire itself. And though we can't distance ourselves from the darker side of the history, the monument has provided an inspirational beacon over the centuries. Literally, the design of the monument structure was intended so that the orb could be used to mount, launch and display fireworks, as happened during the funeral of the Duke of Wellington and through the laying of the foundation stones of the 19th century London Bridge. But a slightly more symbolic beacon occurred on the 18th of April 1913. On this date, at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 suffragettes named Ethel Spark and Gertrude Shaw went to the top of the structure. They did this by this is one of my favourite parts, they did this by distracting the attendants before locking them in the office. Once on the balcony, the women unfurled the purple, white and green flag of the WSPU and tied a banner to the railings which read "Death or Victory." An enormous crowd of men gathered outside, onto which the ladies released thousands of propaganda flyers. It would take hours to get them down, and happily no charges were brought. But really, for my final thoughts this afternoon, I just want to talk a little bit more about the experience of the monument during the 20th century. Of course, a century for London that's been in many ways symbolised by war. As in the Second World War, during the Great Fire, the monument was closed to the public. And between 1914 to 1919, it was given not just a new purpose, but also a new name. Taken over by the Royal Navy, it was officially known during this period as HMS Monument. But it is during the Second World War, and one picture in particular, that I'd like to finish today. Like the Great War, the monument was once again closed to the public, and it would not reopen again until the 13th of August 1945. Now, during this period, London would experience destruction dwarfing across the city that caused by the Great Fire in 1666. And it's with that in mind that I would like to end today with this image. For what you can see in this image here is a real contrast in the scene. For the monument is standing, as it still does today, as it has all the way since 1677, memorialising the Great Fire of London with only superficial damage. And this is how it ended the Second World War, with little more than scratches and chips. But for me, I feel that this picture captures something else. You notice when you look at it the absolute destruction that exists around. though on people's faces there's a familiarity of the bomb damage and the dress of people merely going about their day on their ways to work. And it is with the frieze of Cibber in the background that you can see in here that we get a contrast in comparison transcending down through the centuries. For as London lays in rubble, the people are carrying on. And just like the encouragement shown in that frieze by Father Time, similarly, the city, as from 1666, is once again being rebuilt. And ultimately, to conclude, I feel that this picture lends itself an air of optimism, which, as in 1677, complete with the guiding arm of King Charles II taking centre stage after a turbulent 18 months, just as in 1666, all the way back to the Blitz of 1940, King Charles is once again taking centre stage. Well, folks, thank you very much for listening to my talk this afternoon, and thank you to Dr. Johnson's House, and thank you to the Fleet Street Quarter for inviting me to come and tell you a little bit more, or talk to you a bit more about the turbulent mid-1660s and their visible impact still memorialised in the monument to the Great Fire of London. As I mentioned at the start, my name is David. I'm the founder of a new independent walking tour company, Heritage Guides. If you would like to know a bit more... got a slide. If you would like to know a bit more about the topic covered today, or visit some of the sites involved, we'd be delighted to have you on our Great Fire of London walk, which runs on the final Saturday of every month, and starts from the very edge of the fire spread at Smithfield, making its way back down to the centre of Pudding Lane and the monument itself. And thank you very much, folks. So I hope everybody's enjoyed that, and I'll open up if anyone has any questions. I will endeavour to answer as best I can. But thank you very much for having me this afternoon.
Thank you, David. That was really educational. For somebody who's been in the city so long and walked past the monument so many times, it was amazing to see it with such fresh eyes and the context of the political landscape as well before. Fascinating. Questions for David, anybody? Yes.
You mentioned, I think it's the Declaration of Rare Earth.
Yes.
And one of the things was private property